Hey everyone, it's Ornlu, and I am here today with a bit of a different type of video. So, with AoE2 expansions being introduced relatively frequently, the AoE2 community is growing increasingly contentious over a very basic question. What is an AoE2 civilization? Obviously, yes, they are the factions that you play as in the game, but what are those factions based off? What do they represent? Why are they in the game in the first place? Basically, this can be seen as the companion piece to State of the Civs, which focuses entirely on the implementation of each civilization within multiplayer gameplay. Here, I'm going to take the opposite approach and look at the evolving historical and game design logic of the AoE2 civilizations. To be honest, covering the history and design of the Civs in AoE2 is something I've wanted to do for a long time, but I figured that most people would find it extremely dull. However, with the spirited debate on recent expansions, I feel like you guys would actually enjoy this journey into the history and depths of game design. In particular, this first video is going to cover the origins of civilizations in AoE2 and the history and logic of all 13 original Age of Kings civilizations. I'm still not sure what you guys will think of this type of video, so if you are interested, please be sure to leave a like, comment on what you find most interesting or problematic about AoE2 civilization design, and subscribe to the channel for tons more AoE2 content. With that, let's start this journey. So before we go through the various expansions of the game, we must first come up with the basic framework of what an AoE2 civilization is, or at least what it represents. At a fundamental level, each civ represents what we could call a civilization from the Middle Ages, or more specifically from the 400 CE through the end of the 1500 CE. Yes, the idea of a Middle Ages is inherently Eurocentric when it comes to starting and ending, but nevertheless it immediately gives the player a clear sense of setting for the game, i.e. swords and knights and stuff. Of course, the entities portrayed by the Civs in AoE2 in general represent broader cultures, encompassing multiple people groups and political entities. In a game with a limited number of faction slots, this is actually very helpful, as it gives the devs a greater degree of depth of history to draw from, and a bit more artistic license with the Civs themselves. For instance, making a Civ Franks instead of the Kingdom of France allows the devs to draw from the Franks themselves, the Carolingians, all the way through the House of Valois at the end of the AoE2 timeframe. From a campaign design perspective, you can use Franks to represent numerous different factions, from Joan of Arc to the Burgundians to Reynald de Chatillon and the Crusaders. All in all, broader civilizations just give you more to work with than specific polities. However, as many people seem to forget in online discourse, Age of Empires 2 is a video game that is supposed to be fun and condensed in a way that is clear and streamlined for both campaigns and multiplayer games. Therefore, in some ways, every civilization in AoE2 requires a significant degree of oversimplification, such as limiting the number of technologies, unit types, unit models, etc., to be consistent across every civ. But in other ways, AoE2 has to take a large slice of artistic liberty to create unique playstyles, strengths, and weaknesses via bonuses, unique units, and unique techs. By this, I mean that AoE2 would be a very boring game if armies were 90% untrained levies with spears and clubs, only supported by cavalry, archers, and siege. Especially with AoE2 being a relatively fast-paced game, the numbers of soldiers in a battle are obviously far smaller than in real life, as are the time and resources required to build your civilization and field an army. This is called making AoE2 a fun game, and considering the fact that we are all still playing it over 2 decades later, I would say that the basic Civ formula and gameplay loop have been a resounding success. Of course, what exactly constitutes a distinct civilization, its relevance to the time period, and the degree to which various people groups and political systems belong into them are all questions that have been answered differently throughout the past 27 years of the game's development, and will be explored throughout this video. What I plan on doing is taking a look at each expansion of the game, talk about why each civilization entry has its place, from a broader setting of the expansion down to the specific name chosen of that faction. I will do my best to combine any info we have from the devs with my own conjecture and reasoning, with the most unrealistic hope being that you guys actually find this interesting. But hey, what else do I have to do with my time other than to talk about AoE2 in history? So, let's go. Of course, we have to start at the beginning, which is the original Age of Kings release. As this was both the first and largest batch of civs ever added to the game, much of all future civilizations are based on the archetypes presented in the original version of AoE2. Many of these basic design choices had their roots in AoE1. For instance, the number of civs at launch is almost exactly the same, of 12 in AoE1 and 13 in AoE2. Their geographic geographically split between 4 different regions/architecture sets, and share mostly the same technology tree, with the primary differences between civilizations coming from a unique set of limitations within that tech tree, as well as a set of distinct bonuses. Age of Kings also took that extra step of adding a unique unit for every single civ, which was not actually an AoE 1. Now, how exactly the 13 civs were chosen is an interesting question. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to find interviews or discussions as to the design choices of the original ensemble devs, but not impossible. I still have in my possession the official Age of Kings strategy guide, which actually has a couple of chapters covering the game's development, which I will be referencing throughout this video. In addition, GameSpot, remember that website, did a showcase on each of the civilizations, and I read through those a ton as a kid. Although GameSpot for some reason deleted these for Age of Kings, my viewer Boom the Dummy was nice enough to go through the old internet archive to dig them up, so we can at least use sections of these as well. So, the civs. Although we can only guess the reasoning behind each civilization's inclusion, we do actually know the order in which they were added to the game files. This info can be easily found in the Genie editor, where the civilizations are listed in the following order: Britons, Franks, Goths, Teutons, Japanese, Chinese, Byzantines, Persians, Saracens, Turks, Vikings, Mongols, Celts. If you noticed, the first 9 of these civs were also the default civs in the scenario editor in both AOC and in HD, with player 1 being the Britons, all the way down to Gaia being the Saracens. You may also notice that the first 8 civs represent 2 of each region or architecture set: Britons and Franks for Western Europe, Goths and Teutons for Central Europe, Japanese and Chinese for East Asia, and Byzantines and Persians for the Middle East. The remaining civs round out the original cast to balance out the regions with 4 Middle East civs and 3 of everything else. With that in mind, let's just go through the civs. For our first 2 civs, the Britons and Franks, it really makes sense to talk about them together. We have to remember that AoE2 was a game made in the late 90s by an American developer and publisher, and was focused primarily on a Western audience. Most of the popular image of the Middle Ages comes from medieval Britain and France, so it really is a no-brainer that these would be the first 2 civs included. This can be further seen in the original menu UI, most of the unit models, and the first campaign that was designed, Joan of Arc, all of which have their aesthetic drawn from medieval England and France. Heck, a British-looking king is front and center on the game's cover art. As for their specific names, the Britons and Franks, we see the common decision to use the early Middle Age names for both the English and French, which may seem odd at first glance. However, our handy AoE2 strategy guide enlightens us to the fact that AoE2 originally had a more restrictive time frame, only covering 500 CE to 1000 CE. This time frame predates the concepts of the English and French, so it made sense to use those earlier names. Even when the time frame was expanded another 500 years, we have to imagine that they just kept the names they started with. Interestingly, in the original pitch for Age of Kings, which is luckily included in the official strategy guide, the first list of proposed, quote, cultures included England, Wales, and Scotland all as separate civilizations. Obviously, Welsh wouldn't make the final cut, but it is interesting to know that they were being considered. Other examples of civs from that list that did not make the cut of the original game were Austria, Christian Spain, and Hungary. Nevertheless, considering the basic identity of the civs that did make it into the game, Britons focus on archers and Franks on cavalry, which reflects the pop culture understanding of medieval Britain and France, with French cavalry charging down English longbowmen like at Agincourt. Obviously, the Britons get the longbow as their unique unit, but the Franks get something different, the throwing axeman. To paraphrase Age of Kings lead designer Greg Street in the aforementioned GameSpot interviews, the devs did not want to give Franks a heavy cavalry unique unit when they already had the awesome paladins. In their minds, Franks were supposed to be a flexible civ, so they wanted a unit that would complement, instead of compete for, the heavy cavalry role. Throwing axemen indeed complement the knight line as an anti-pikeman unit, and it gives the civ some flavor for their actual Frankish roots, so that is a nice touch. Both Britons and Franks are clearly designed to be the most approachable and familiar civilizations to a new player, and their straightforward bonuses and obvious power units certainly help a player navigate the complexities of AoE2. Okay, this is already getting long, so let's move on to our next civs. The first Central European civ is the Goths, who, per the GameSpot interview, were chosen to be the representative of the various Germanic tribes that swept across Europe throughout the early part of the AoE2 timeframe. Therefore, in addition to the Visigoths and Ostrogoths specifically, the civ was meant to serve as a stand-in for groups like the Saxons, Avars, and Vandals. Additionally, I find it interesting that the Goths were also used as a stand-in for all of the Eastern Europeans, such as the Poles and Rus in the original campaigns, as there was no other civ to properly represent them. In any case, people may find the addition of an AoE2 civilization that had all died out by the 800s a bit odd, but in my view there are two good reasons for this. One is that the game was originally designed to end in the year 1000, like I said earlier, so the Goths alongside the Britons and Franks make sense. And two, they really are a civ that embodies the Dark Ages in Europe. This speaks to the gameplay flavor of the Goths, which is all about spamming hordes of infantry as opposed to developing your economy or technology. Now, historically, we know very little about the Goths and their culture relative to the other AoE2 civs, especially the Age of Kings ones, which is why they were the only original civ to not possess unique voice lines, but rather sharing them with the Teutons. But we do know that historically, Goths mostly fought on horseback, which would make their gameplay more logically follow the Huns that were added later on. However, and this is just my conjecture, the Goths and other barbarian groups that sacked the Roman Empire were commonly portrayed in media as hordes of foot soldiers bashing down the smaller, more elite armies of the Romans. Just look at the movie Gladiator, which came out the year after AoE2, where this same dynamic takes place. Also, the hordes of cheap, weak units archetype is a popular one in strategy games, so having the Goths fill that role just works out fine from a gameplay perspective. The next of the Central European civs is the Teutons, which the original devs created as the eastern half of Charlemagne's empire that would eventually grow into the Holy Roman Empire. In addition, most of the crusading orders are covered by the Teutons, with the Teutonic Knight and Monk play fleshing out that general theme. The name Teutons also follows the convention of using the early Middle Ages names for the in-game civilization, as the Teutons were an early Germanic group in the area. Holy Roman Empire obviously does not work for a civ name in AoE2, so I guess the only other choice would be the Germans, but I feel like that's attributing a modern concept to an ancient civilization, so I personally like Teutons here. As for why to include the Teutons in the game, well, obviously the Holy Roman Empire was a huge player in Europe during the Middle Ages, but I do find this quote from the strategy guide interesting. "We chose to build our campaigns around individual heroes from the Middle Ages to create stories more attractive to the casual gamer. We then went through the process of listing great heroes of the time period, ranking them by recognition and story. Being aware of the incredible success of AoE in Europe, especially Germany, we chose Joan of Arc, Frederick Barbarossa, Genghis Khan, and Saladin for campaigns. As you can see, the success and popularity of AoE 1, especially in Germany, led to the inclusion of the campaign of a famous German king from the Middle Ages that is pretty much completely unknown to an American audience, so there is clearly something of a shout out there. When it comes to the Teutonic gameplay of defenses and slow, powerful armies, I could not find specific reasoning from the early internet sources, other than a line from the GameSpot interview series where they wanted to highlight their differences from the other half of Charlemagne's empire, which would of course be the Franks. It actually works nicely that the aggressive, speedy Franks serve as a foil both historically and gameplay-wise to both the Britons and Teutons. Seeing how these historical considerations for game design play out is really the whole point in making this series, so hopefully you guys find this as interesting as I do. Moving now to East Asia, we have the first two and most obvious civilizations to represent the region, Japanese and Chinese. These guys, along with Persians, are the only civilizations in Age of Kings to have a direct analog in AoE 1, with the Yamato serving as the precursor to the Japanese, and the Shang doing the same for the Chinese. I do find it interesting that Age of Empires 1 used the names of dynasties for the East Asian civilizations, whereas they did not do so for the other regions. Regardless, for AoE 2, they used the modern naming conventions for these two civs, likely as they would be the most immediately recognizable to the casual player. Now, to break these civs down individually, I don't think I need to go into detail as to why it makes sense to add these civs to AoE 2, as the Chinese and soon-to-be Japanese are the only civs that have appeared in every single entry of the Age of Empires franchise. But starting with the Japanese, this civilization represents all of the various clans and factions of the Japanese islands that existed in varying degrees of political and cultural cohesion throughout the Middle Ages. Still, the mythos of the Emperor in Kyoto remained an important part of Japanese culture throughout the entirety of the AoE 2 time period, so for the purposes of making a video game, I would say that having one civ representing all of Japan works just fine. I do think it interesting interesting that Japan, in the AoE2 timeframe, was not a major military player in the region, and in fact did not interact with the other civilizations presented in Age of King in any meaningful way except for the failed Mongol invasions. However, the image of the kimono-clad, katana-wielding samurai stalking through the rice paddies exists as such a strong image in Western pop history that it would be odd not to include them in a medieval game. Heck, a figure that is likely one of the Minamoto clan is on the cover art of the game. When it comes to the Japanese in-game, they are interestingly quite different from the AoE1 Yamato. In the original game, Yamato were all about cavalry and cav archers, whereas in AoE2, it's all about infantry, archers, and navy. Unfortunately, the Japanese GameSpot showcase is no longer available, but I do remember the original devs saying that they wanted to be a bit more historically accurate with the Japanese, emphasizing the quality of their katanas as reflected in the faster attack speed, and less so of their cavalry, which was generally of poorer quality when compared to the armies on the mainland. Something like that. What is interesting, however, is that the Japanese have changed in their strengths over time. This would be a topic for a different video series, but with the addition of bloodlines and later a powerful cav archer bonus, Japanese are shifting back to being more of a mobility-oriented civilization, especially at high levels. In general, though, Japanese are a flavorful addition to the game, showcasing the famous samurai and a wide array of military options, reflecting their more martial culture than compared to the more economically focused China. Speaking of which, the Chinese. Now, obviously, there is plenty to talk about when it comes to the Chinese and the Three Kingdoms DLC, and if this series is interesting to enough people, we will get there eventually. For now, we are going to consider the Chinese as they were originally implemented in Age of Kings. Like Japanese, the Chinese were originally an Age of Empires 1 civilization, where they were known as the Shang, which was one of the earliest Chinese kingdoms. But keeping things consistent with more modern naming conventions, the term Chinese was clearly meant to be a catch-all term to cover the various Han-dominated dynasties of the Middle Ages, especially as the original in-game Chinese history section specifically uses the start of the Tang Dynasty and the end of the Ming Dynasty as the timeframe of the civilization in AoE2. However, as indicated by the addition of camels, as well as the usage of the Civ to cover many non-Han Chinese and Genghis Khan III into China, up until the Three Kingdoms expansion, this Civ also included the Sinicized non-Han kingdoms like the Tonguts and Jurchens. In-game, the Chinese actually do retain much of their flavor from AoE1, especially when it comes to the economy. In the first installment of the series, Chinese had cheaper villagers, and at Age 2, they start with more villagers. Both of these bonuses clearly represent the huge population of the Chinese kingdoms throughout the Middle Ages. This, combined with their tech discount and farm bonus, give Chinese one of the strongest economic identities in the original game, which, as I mentioned earlier, provides a nice foil to the more aggressive Japanese and even Mongols. There's not much else to say, honestly, when it comes to the Chinese, but I did find this quote from the GameSpot interview very fun. Adding to the list of Sandy Peterson quotes to perhaps not age all that well, we have this. Beginners like the Chinese because their advantages are easy to understand and take advantage of. Even if you're not so great at zooming up through the ages, you know that with the Chinese you can make it to feudal without breaking a sweat. I am sure the irony of this quote is not lost on most of you, as the difficult start of the civilization without food and less wood has made Chinese one of, if not the most challenging civilizations for beginners to master. Lastly, it is worth noting that the Chinese unique unit, the Chukonnu, was not really used all that much in the AoE2 timeframe, and was more characteristic of the earlier Han Dynasty, where even then it wasn't exactly ubiquitous. It's not stated explicitly anywhere, especially as the second half of the GameSpot interview is now lost forever, but the decision to make the Chukonnu the Chinese unique unit probably comes from the fact that the repeating crossbow is cool, and it's a flavorful visual to represent China's relative technological advantage over their contemporaries. Honestly, it's a pretty innocuous historical inaccuracy in my opinion, so let's march on. Next up is the first Middle Eastern duo of the Byzantines and Persians. Other than the fact that these civilizations fought against each other a bunch historically, they don't really have any overarching design similarities, so let's just go ahead and tackle them individually. Starting with the Byzantines, they really were another obvious choice to add to any medieval era game. In fact, it was the Byzantine Empire's time frame from 476 CE to 1453 CE that bracketed the entire concept of the Middle Ages in Europe. Indeed, in the original Age of Kings pitch, the first proposal of different, quote, cultures included what they would call Byzantium and then in parentheses, Eastern Roman Empire. This does allude to the naming conundrum when it comes to the Byzantines, who called themselves the Romans of the Eastern Roman Empire or just Roman Empire. Byzantines would only be given as a name later to Constantinople's half of the empire, specifically during the time period after the fall of Rome itself. Because of this, I think it's actually clearer to the casual player to name the Civ Byzantines so as not to confuse the Greek-dominated Orthodox Eastern Roman Empire of the Middle Ages with the legionaries of Caesar in Rome. In addition to representing the Byzantine Empire itself, as well as its offshoots, the Byzantines also served as a catch-all for Eastern Christians, and was used for many of the Crusader states, Greek kingdoms, and even the Venetians in the campaigns. When it came to implementing the Civ in-game, the Ensemble devs made no secret that the Byzantines were supposed to be the most advanced civilization with the most technologies available, representing their place as the most technologically advanced empire in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Interestingly, Byzantines indeed had the most technologies during the release of Age of Kings, and in practice, they still have the most complete tech tree of any Civ in the game 26 years later. Beyond that, Byzantines emphasized defense, counter units, and navy, reflecting the empire's constant defense against hordes of invaders, both Christian and Muslim. Considering their unique unit, the Cataphract, I again have no direct records of why an anti-infantry cavalry unit was chosen to be the Byzantine unique unit, although it stylistically works well as the Byzantines did indeed use cataphracts extensively. Also, it works well that the defining unit of the Byzantines is another counter unit. Notably, the Persians themselves used a heavy cavalry corps that was commonly referred to as the cataphracts, but the Ensemble devs chose to take that civ in a different direction, which we will get to now. Indeed, the Persians were the third and final civilization to exist in both AoE 1 and AoE 2, and unlike the Chinese and Japanese, they even kept the same name. When it comes to the name Persians, the devs actually only intended the Persians to represent the Sassanids, as evidenced by their in-game history stating that the Persians lasted from 224 to 651 CE. This is very early for an AoE 2 civ, and based on these parameters, would only have the Persians last about as long into the AoE 2 timeframe as the Goths. In fact, the basic design of the Persians in AoE 2 was heavily based off of the civilization in AoE 1, with a strong early economy and a preeminent focus on cavalry and especially war elephants. Just like in Age 1, Persians had the most complete stable of any civilization, and were even given a super heavy cavalry unique unit on top of all that. And yes, the devs did admit that Persian war elephants were an anachronism in the AoE 2 timeframe, but also that elephants have an irreplaceable cool factor, a point to which I cannot disagree. However, in addition to the Sassanids, the Persians in AoE 2 also represented the Khwarezmian Empire that you destroy in Genghis Khan 4, and over time, the scope of Persians in AoE 2 has expanded. So, pretty uniquely among the civs in-game, for much of the Middle Ages, the Persian culture, or what you could call civilization, existed without a specific ethnic or political entity. By this, I mean that even when the various Iranian people groups were ruled by non-Iranians, Persian culture, whether it be writing, poetry, or legal systems, or what have you, all continued to exist for the entirety of the Middle Ages, and were in many cases co-opted by the Arabs, Turks, and Mongols. In fact, by the end of the Middle Ages, Persian civilization was rejuvenated by the expansion of the Safavids, who were later integrated into the existing Persian civilization with the Mountain Royals DLC many years later. In the original game, Persians had the fewest bonuses of any civilization, with only 2 plus a team bonus, which for many years led to players considering the civilization boring, especially as war elephants have always been niche. It's really only through the many additions and alterations to the Persians that we have the much more multifaceted civ that exists in DE today, even as they retain their original TC and dock bonuses, extra striding resources, and mighty war elephants. Now, with 8 civilizations down and 2 from each region, the devs looked to round out the civ roster with other notable civilizations that exemplified the Middle Ages in Western pop history. The Saracens, Turks, Vikings, and Mongols were all considered from the very first Age of Kings proposal that I've alluded to multiple times, giving us the 12 civilizations at launch that was the same as AoE 1. However, due to the selection of civs here, it gives the player 4 Middle Eastern civs and only 2 Western European civs, and for that, among other reasons, the Celts were tacked on at the end as Lucky Civ 13. We'll talk more about them later, so let's start with the other, more obvious choices for civs. When it comes to the civilization that would be called Saracens, there is a lot of interesting and potentially controversial discussion to be had. On the one hand, a civilization representing the Islamic caliphates of the Middle Ages is another no-brainer. They were powerful militarily, extremely important culturally and religiously, and fought numerous wars against the other civs on the roster. Unfortunately, due to the civilization naming conventions used with all of the other civs, what exactly to call the future Saracens is a bit tricky. The original Age of Kings pitch comically called them the quote Muslims alongside the Ottomans. Yeah, that doesn't really work. Political issues aside, AoE2 civs are not named after religions. In theory, you could call them Arabs or Egyptians, but both of those, on top of being politically loaded terms even in the late 90s, necessarily exclude many of the people and political entities you were trying to represent. Another option would be to call them by one of the Caliphate dynasties, like they later did with the Abbasids in AoE4. However, we don't name civilizations based on specific political entities in AoE2, and especially if they wanted to do a Saladin and the Crusaders campaign, that really wouldn't work either. So we get the Saracens, and I'll let this quote from Greg Street take it from here. The Greek word Saracen first described nomadic Syrians, then Arabs, and was later used by the Europeans to describe any Muslim. While this name is most closely tied with Arabs, the Middle East was quite a jumble of cultures in the era of the Crusades. Turks had moved down from Anatolia, Persians had come in from Iran, and much of the area in between was still in the hands of the Arabs left over from the conquests of the Prophet. The Crusaders called the whole lot Saracens, and so do we. Thus, in Age of Kings, the Saracens are the Muslim states of the Middle East, not including the Muslim Turks, which formed a strong region under unified Islamic control. Although Islam itself was subject to a schism within its ranks, to the outside observer and the Europeans of the Middle Ages, the Saracens were in essence the aggregate forces of Islam. So yeah, an archaic pejorative term used by the Europeans to refer to the quote others that they crusaded against. The late 90s were a different time for sure. That said, in my opinion, since the word Saracen is not used as a derogatory term anymore, at least in common discourse, and since we really don't have a better replacement, Saracens works just fine for the civilization. That was a lot on the naming of Saracens, so just to quickly cover how they are represented in the game, the Mamluk unique unit certainly reflects more of the Western stereotypes of the Middle East and Muslims, and again, it would not fly in 2025. Mamluk as a name is totally fine, but as the future devs said during the Louvre exhibition 26 years later, this depiction of the Mamluk unit in Age of Empires 2DE is not historically sound, but it represents the unit as it first appeared in the original game. As the Louvre historians explained, Mamluks would ride horses and use sabers, lances, and bows. Beyond their unique unit, Saracens emphasize a wide tech tree, a powerful market bonus, and the utilization of swift-mounted units, all of which actually do a pretty good job of representing the Middle Eastern caliphates. For a civ that came out in 1999, the AoE2 Saracens remain a beloved civ by the community, and I for one would be really sad if they were split up or heavily reworked at this point. Our final Middle Eastern civilization in Age of Kings is going to be the Turks, the neighbors of the Saracens and Byzantines. The Turks were another part of the oft-mentioned original Age of Kings pitch, then called the Ottomans. Again, as the Ottomans are a specific political entity, the civilization was eventually changed to the broader Turks, who at the time not only also represented the Seljuks in the campaigns, but also all of the Central Asian Turkic peoples as well, at least until more civs were added much later on. As it stood though, most of the design aspects of the Turks were nevertheless based on the Ottoman Empire, with a heavy focus on gunpowder and the Janissary as a unique unit, which was the elite group of soldiers in the Ottoman army. Still, the remnants of the semi-nomadic Seljuks remained, especially over time, as the Turks had and have access to some of the most powerful light cavalry and cav archers. In a way, you can think of the Turks as starting as the Seljuks and transitioning into the Ottomans in the Imperial Age. Still, in Age of Kings, Turks had one of the most extreme designs, lacking both elite skirmisher and pikemen, whilst boasting a plethora of gunpowder units and Imperial Age bonuses. From a game design perspective, it certainly makes sense to create a civ archetype that is all about the late game, and from a history standpoint, the Turks were early adoptees of gunpowder and used it extensively versus the Europeans. Indeed, historians have grouped the Ottoman, Safavid Persians, and Mughal Indians as the quote gunpowder empires, which really highlights the image of these entities in the mind of Western pop history. Not that a focus on gunpowder is an incorrect characterization of the Ottomans, they sure did make great use of things that went boom, but it is nevertheless the most well-known aspect of the civ for a casual player, so it makes plenty of sense that the in-game civ is designed around that as well. Going back to Northern Europe, another civilization from the original pitch was the Vikings. They're called the Norsemen and then in parentheses, Vikings from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The idea of Vikings is another obvious inclusion in a medieval era game, as the vision of a huge bearded man emerging from the sea and swinging a gigantic axe is about as ingrained in Western pop history as you can get. Indeed, a properly horned helmeted Viking is the third and final figure on the game's original cover art. In their original notes, some of the earliest topics the devs looked to explore was both the entire Viking age and the figure of Harald Hardrada in particular. Side note, almost all of the military leaders from this first document were either added to the game via campaigns or added as standalone hero units in the scenario editor. This includes Charlemagne, Harald Hardrada, the Black Prince, Alexander Nevsky, and Tamerlane. In fact, the only one that wasn't added to the game by AOC from this list was poor Jan Hus, whose campaign would have to wait for another 23 years. Anyway, back to the Vikings. You can see that the Civ was added to the game pop history first, so there are several basic historical inaccuracies or omissions. First, the name Vikings specifically refers to the raiders that came from the sea and made many European monks quite sad/dead. The term does not refer to an actual civilization, which would be the Norse, Danes, or Swedes. Still, the word Viking is much more recognizable to the average person, so it does make sense why they still went with that. Similarly, as many people know at this point, the whole horned helmet thing that is depicted on the cover art and the unique unit is completely ahistorical unless you are talking about opera. But again, it's what's recognizable. Furthermore, although the Viking Age died out by the end of the 11th century, the Norse persisted and developed kingdoms more analogous to those throughout Europe. This is another case of the Civ likely originating in a time where the game's time frame was basically just the Dark Ages in Europe. That said, in most other aspects, the depiction of the Vikings is pretty reasonably accurate. A heavy emphasis on aggression, infantry, and navy certainly encapsulates the Viking-era Norse effectively, and the idea of berserks raiding the coastline from longboats does have a very real basis in history. It is true that the Vikings are still best known for their economy bonus, which does perhaps exist as a bit of fantasy, but nevertheless allows the Viking player to lean into that aggressive playstyle. Yes, the Vikings are heavily influenced by pop history, but they're also a fun civ that is not totally devoid of historical logic, so I think we can forgive the creative liberties taken by Ensemble to create the compelling experience that playing the AoE2 Vikings provides the player. The third and final East Asian Age of Kings civilization is, of course, the Mongols. Another civilization from the original pitch of the game, and another one of the most obvious possible picks for a medieval-era game. Honestly, this might just be the most straightforward section of all. The name Mongols, of course, refers to all of the Mongol tribes in northeastern Asia, and originally included pretty much all of the steppe peoples throughout Eurasia. Over time, those cultures got their own civilizations, but since they were all conquered by the Mongols at some point anyway, it was never that egregious. Of course, the main design aspect of Mongols is during the reign of Genghis Khan and his successors, who forged the largest land empire in world history. The steppe warriors raiding and firing arrows from horseback is certainly very popular in Western pop history, and the name of Genghis Khan is probably the single most famous Middle Ages figure, at least in America, alongside Joan of Arc. Naturally, Genghis Khan and his conquests were included as one of the original campaigns of the game. As for the historical implementation of the Mongols, it's pretty straightforward how the history translates to gameplay. The Mongols and other steppe nomads fought in a way that was so drastically different to most of the Europeans and Asians they warred against, that creating an in-game playstyle around speed, raiding, and mobility was incredibly obvious. I will say also that the hunt bonus, while making a reasonable amount of sense historically, as the Mongols relied less on agriculture than most civs, also serves to create the speed of the Mongols by launching the player through the Dark Age faster than any other civ. It's a great way to use an in-game bonus to represent a historical attribute of a civilization. Other than that, I can only provide another Sandy Peterson quote that did not age well from the GameSpot series, where he says regarding the hunt bonus, "The Mongols have an insane hunting bonus that makes them the only civilization that can really turn to hunting as a viable and preferable means of food gathering and age advancement. Remember everybody, only gather hunt as Mongols. It's bad with every other civ." Joking aside, the devs obviously had no way of knowing how the meta would develop over the years. It's just fun to look back on how different the game was seen in 1999. As for Mongols, they are the most popular civ online, one of the most famous cultures from the Middle Ages, and an excellent marriage of history and gameplay. Last but not least, we have the Celts. As I mentioned earlier, the original 12 civs selected did leave Western Europe one civ short of the other regions, and the Celts made only too much sense to add in the end. Why? Because of that historically accurate cinematic masterpiece Braveheart, which came out in 1995, made by the legendary figure of moral authority Mel Gibson, who played William Wallace. Again, the 90s were a much different era. In the original Age of Kings pitch, in the list of famous historical figures, they literally have William Wallace in parentheses Braveheart. The movie was hugely popular in the West, and was recent enough that any game associated with the Middle Ages would conjure up images of the movie. As for AoE2 itself, the development story of the game in the original strategy guide states that Age of Kings was very difficult to approach for those who had no experience in RTS games. Therefore, it was only towards the end of production that the learning campaign was added to the game. Now, this is just my personal conjecture, but I am sure that it made all the sense in the world to bring the Celts and William Wallace to introduce a casual player to Age of Empires 2. After all, at the time, there were likely very few other historical figures that would have been as recognizable as Sir William. Beyond the basic decision to include Celts, however, they still had to follow all of the other civilization design conventions. The name Celts follows the same trend of using the early Middle Ages name for the peoples that include the Scots and Irish, just like the Britons and Franks. When it came to the unique unit, again with Braveheart in mind, the obvious choice was to go for the Woad Raider. Of course, the Woad Raider is very incorrectly placed historically, as they belong to the ancient Picts, as opposed to the medieval Scots. Still, the image of Mel Gibson with blue face paint was not one the devs wanted to challenge, so Woad Raiders it was. That said, Celts and their Woad Raiders did nicely align with the other Western European civilizations, which, as the most recognizable to the average American player, were all straightforward and focused on different unit types. Britons made archers, Franks made cavalry and gunpowder, and Celts made infantry and siege units. From a basic gameplay design perspective, this triangle makes a lot of sense. Lastly, it is worth mentioning that the final three civilizations, the Vikings, Mongols, and Celts, were all originally designed to be raider civilizations and would play differently from the others. Unfortunately, most of the GameSpot articles are still lost to time, but I do remember the Ensemble devs talking about kidnapping villagers with the scout cavalry, stealing resources, and other such features. Notably, the guidebook does mention those as being cut features from Age of Kings in favor of more streamlined gameplay. Personally, I think this was a very wise decision, as the similarity of each civilization with one another is part of what makes Age of Empires more approachable than most real-time strategy games. Yes, the civilizations all have unique flavor, strengths and weaknesses, but they all gather resources, grow their bases, and train units in basically the same way. Well, there you have it, guys. That is the story of how we got the original 13 Age of Kings civilizations, based on my own research, memory, and intuition. You can see that, although the priorities and understanding of history were different back then in the late 90s, we still ended up with 13 civilizations that represented a fairly complete swath of the world in the Middle Ages, and all felt unique and memorable in their own way. But definitely let me know what you think of this series in the comments. As you can imagine, this video took a ton of time to make, and although I enjoyed it greatly, I really can only justify doing this if you guys like it too. If indeed this video is popular enough, the next one will cover Age of Conquerors and the Forgotten. Before I go, I do need to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters who help make these long-form videos possible, with Dan and Jared in the Great Wolf tier, and Carolyn, Dieter, Liquid Egg Product, Rairu, and Tandoori Knight in the Dire Wolf tier. But as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.